Good morning, y'all. It's Ben here at Bates Nursery. And, it's chilly outside, but we are ready to start talking about edible garden planting. It's kind of time to start getting your seedlings started if that's what you're going to do. And direct sowing for cool season crops is coming up pretty shortly here in a few weeks. So we're going to talk about it. Like, how do I decide what to plant? Where am I going to put my beds? How am I going to grow it? A lot of options. If you've already got your beds like me, set where they're going to go, it may make things easier. If you're starting from scratch, great. You get to kind of lay out what you're going to grow and where, and you've got a lot of options. It can be overwhelming, but I usually just try to think of the things that I'm going to use and eat. Maybe even start with recipes you really like, and start with those things that are really going to help you and that you're going to harvest and use. So, it's February, guys. It's February 1st. What's going on? I mean, it was icy a couple weeks ago, and it was almost spring weather last week. We're starting to see longer days, and that means it's time to start getting the beds prepped. Planning is kind of a big one. I mean, if you haven't already started planning, it's a good way. If you were going to start from seed and order your seeds, you probably want to do that ASAP. So a plan can help you know what to get. You can also buy, I've bought collections of seeds. If you don't really know where to start, you can buy an heirloom seed package and kind of pick from that to see your options. So start getting our plan down. Edible shrubs and trees. I'm not going to talk about that too much today, but peach trees and apple trees and pear trees, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, great options to plant right now. They'll do just fine if we get a good freeze over the winter, and it's an easy time to transplant on the tree and on us. So tree shrubs, we have a great selection right now at Bates, actually. Even though it's kind of not the season for us to have veggie starts, you can definitely get trees and shrubs down, and that's going to be great for permanent edible gardening areas, and you can get production year after year. So I definitely recommend trees and shrubs for fruit. This is just going to extend your harvest and give you that kind of bumper crop when your veggies are out of season, and they're just reliable and delicious. So yeah, edible trees and shrubs, stick them in the ground. Seedlings, direct sow is coming up. If cold season crops, you should probably already have those seedlings started. I would say most people in our area probably direct sow our cool season crops, and we'll kind of touch on those in a minute. So, decisions. How do we make the decisions? That's part of our design process. And here in a minute, we're going to talk about my personal beds, and we'll pop a picture up there, and we'll kind of use a real world experience to go through design process and what we want to put out there. What are you going to grow? I mean, vegetables, is pretty much a given around here. Tomatoes, cucumbers, cool season vegetables coming up, spinach, carrots, kale, stuff like that. Herbs. I mean, I love herbs in my garden. I even brought a few harvests from this morning. This is my sage, and this is its third year in the ground. And it doesn't look like much now, but you can absolutely use this sage. If you're baking, stick it in the oven. I mean, you can use it just for potpourri and just for scent. But this sage is really, really reliable for drought, for a cold winter. I mean, it's just pretty much bulletproof, and it's got a lot of uses. So herbs are great for your garden, and, sometimes they are perennial. A lot of the times they're perennial. Sometimes we have to watch out for that in our garden beds because they'll persist and they may spread. So herbs can become a permanent resident depending on what you have. A lot of times people will stick them in containers for that, and you can have a perennial herb container so you don't have to worry about it competing with your vegetables. So I think herbs are a great option. I touched on fruit. I mean, I think fruit is sometimes overlooked in our vegetable beds, and it's a great kind of companion planting to that area. And then cover crops, you're really past cover crop season at this point. You could do spring cover crops. Say if one of my beds I'm actively growing in, and the other one I just don't have anything until the warm season, I could easily do a cover crop like clover or something like that in this bed Probably here in a month or two, you could direct sow that cover crop if you're not going to be using that bed in the spring. So typically we see cover crops go in the fall to kind of cover those beds where your warm season crops have gone. So just touch on those things and see what you want to grow. I mean, I prefer a combination of vegetables and fruit and herbs. You just may place them in different spots in the bed. I would say majority of my beds, probably 80% of my growth is going to be vegetables and things like that. What are you going to grow in? I mean, here I have raised garden beds. These are 4x8 cedar beds that I have, pretty standard. You could easily just go in the ground, and we may talk about that. But going in the ground has its own benefits, and of course, that's where most of our agriculture production is in the fields. You don't have to worry about water so much when things are in the ground, and you don't have to worry about space. You can really use a lot more space. The downside is going to be weed control. Where your raised beds, you have kind of a contained environment. In the ground, you may need to put black plastic down, or you may need to do a lot of hand pulling, especially in an organic edible garden where there's no herbicide. In the ground is just going to be a little more maintenance as far as weeding, but there's a lot of benefits for care. I mentioned raised beds. Raised beds, if you have a moist area, that's a great option. It'll keep these beds up out of the water. I know a lot of garden tutorials are out of England, and they have notoriously wet soil, so they use a lot of raised beds to get their crops up out of that wet soil. Vice versa, they can go dry. So if you have a dry area, those raised beds are going to need more watering. So just some considerations as to which way you want to go. I think this year we're going to do some crops in the ground, and then we'll continue to use our raised beds just to kind of expand what we can grow, and we'll kind of select those based on where they're going to go. Containers. So over here, I've got a bay in a container. I love growing bay. It is inside my house right now. These are Mediterranean plants like bay and olive and things like that. I think containers are a great component to a really attractive veggie garden. So, if my beds, and we'll talk more about this later, you could easily throw some containers around your vegetable garden area just to give it some sense of playfulness, a little bit more depth. And there's a lot of crops that grow really good in containers. Like I said, Mediterranean plants, like, you could even do banana, bay, things like that. And you could put them out in a big container, and it'll just give it a really cool permanent look. And then you can bring it inside in the winter, and you can harvest these all year round. And they're fairly resilient in the heat. So cool options if you want to add something dramatic to your garden. You could do something as simple as a strawberry pot out in your garden just to give it some interest other than just plain square beds. Great option. I've seen big fruit trees out in the middle of a garden, and it's just a statement. You could do maybe a big fruit tree in a pot kind of right at the entry to a walkway or something to kind of guide you. So consider container gardenings. We have a lot of varieties of fruit, blueberries, raspberries, that are bred to be in containers, especially with smaller properties, smaller yards. That's a great option. This year, I think I'm going to try carrots in a container because carrots really like loose, soft soil, and potting soil is a great way to get that. So this year, we're going to try carrots in containers because that should work fairly well. So that was what we're growing in. Seasonality of crops, and that'll be really the big one right now this time of year. We have cool season and warm season crops, and if you're not that familiar with those, basically all the seeds I have today are cool season crops, and if you look at your seeds, they'll tell you the season to put them in. But generally our cool season crops are going to be growing coming out of winter. We're looking at March, April, and they're really going to kind of fade out when our temperatures get above 90 degrees. So cool season crops we're going to probably put in the ground towards the end of February. Leafy greens, spinaches, beets, what else do I have? Cilantro, lettuce, things like that. Really awesome to grow in the cool weather, very frost tolerant. Leek, that's one of my favorites, and I grow that in my garden. This actually is more of a bulb, and so it can become a perennial crop, and this one can take cool season and warm season. Now, harvest in the summer can affect the taste a little bit. But leek, this is one I pulled out of my veggie garden this morning. Stick this on a pan with some olive oil and herbs and roast that thing at 350 for 30 minutes. Really, really underrated vegetable. Really easy to grow. Pretty blooms too. Spinach. I mean, I've got spinach growing. It had frost on it this morning, but it's very nutritious and very easy to grow. It's not putting on a lot of new growth right now, but this is left over from fall. This could very well carry over into spring and continue to grow without me having to plant more. So cool season crops, really pretty reliable in Middle Tennessee, and sometimes they'll survive all the way through the winter for us. But you'll be thinking about direct sowing now. Warm season crops, I've got the ag extension calendar here, and they recommend seeding here in about 3 weeks for warm season crops, and those usually take a couple months to mature. So we're looking at putting warm season crops in the ground in like April. Maybe late March, April is kind of the idea for those. And we will start bringing in container grown starts. First week of March, about there, we'll start with cool season stuff, and we'll start getting warm season stuff towards the end of March. And warm season stuff is what everyone is familiar with. I mean, tomatoes. I don't know many people who don't like a good fresh grown garden tomato. I mean, there's just something about it. Cucumbers, squash. There are a lot of greens like collard greens and mustard greens you could do in the warm season. I mean, really the bulk of our vegetables are warm season, okra, things like that. Honestly, the hardest part about warm season crops is knowing when to say no and stop adding things because there's so many options. In fact, my wife said this year, less tomatoes. I usually do 8 to 10 tomato plants and they just take over. She said 3, 4, I push it to 5 tomatoes, because I just love them so much, but you can definitely overdo it, especially in raised garden bed space. So if you're going to expand your crops or do some bigger crops, like potatoes seem to take up a lot of room, you may do those straight in the ground instead of your bed, just to give them some room to grow. Just some considerations for warm crops. Maybe we'll talk more about those here in a couple months if y'all want to do a talk on those as the warm season stuff starts getting ready to be put in the ground. Perennial crops, I talked about the leek. That one will kind of continue to grow season after season. All your fruit trees and blueberries. So there's something that you can put maybe on the outside of your veggie garden that's going to give you something every year, and you don't have to worry about it, but you're going to give it a permanent space. I usually like these kind of on the outskirts, maybe 6, 7, 8 feet away from my veggie garden, just to give it a different look. Annual crops. So I do have a list of companion plants here. Celeste down in the garden center was nice enough to put a companion plant list together. A lot of these are annuals and warm season crops, so that's something you'll probably deal more with later in the year. These are going to be things that benefit our other plants, and I think you can very well plant your beds now and then have room for those companion plants later, maybe on the outside of the bed or in between the plants. You're going to do a lot of things like rue, yarrow. Yarrow's a great companion plant. A lot of herbs, marigolds are a pretty common, popular companion plant, and a lot of times what they're going to do is have an effect, say, either on the soil, or a lot of times they're going to have effect on insect control one way or the other. So some can be used as kind of like a bait plant for insects, and some have repelling qualities like most of our herbs for insects. So companion planting, this is something that we will try to make a QR code for y'all so y'all can have access to this out in our greenhouse whenever time comes for these. But this is a lot of annual stuff. So stuff that you'll plant every year and it'll grow very well. It may not produce a crop, but it may have edible leaves or something else that you can use, as well as being pretty and then being beneficial to its neighboring plants. So that's companion planting. A lot of times if you do square foot gardening, say, that'll be a big thing to consider in that process. So consider your annuals. Leave some space for those when planting. Tropicals. So that would be like your container plants, like your bay, your banana, things like that, that you could bring out part of the season and then bring in, and this can be maybe a space that changes from year to year, that you kind of have movable pots and you can change things up. So think about tropical plants too. You're not going to move those outside till probably the end of April when our temperatures are above 50, but something to consider and something you can enjoy inside while it's cold out. I also have some tools, and we'll try to give y'all some links to those. A big resource is our UT extension service, and they have a lot of material. Sometimes it can be a little hard to search on the website, so we'll get y'all some links, maybe some QR codes out here on the lot. But the two main things I really like is they've got a calendar, and this is a really awesome calendar if you just don't really want to think about it. It's similar to like Farmer's Almanac calendars, but they actually have every month, and in between the month, they'll have some kind of pointers, and they'll literally give you a suggestion of when you should start doing certain things for that month, which I think is great. So this is February. They actually have it color coded. So in Nashville, we're Middle Tennessee, it's going to be the blue. So anytime you see a blue day, that's kind of going to give you a suggestion of what to do. And I kind of circled, I mean, for this month, January, they had cool season seeding, I think mid-January. So if you haven't gotten your cool season seeds, if you're growing them inside in pots, you probably should do that now or have already done that. The third week, the 22nd of February, they're saying that's 8 weeks from our last frost date, which is mid to late April. This is saying to start seeds for warm seasons. So at the end of February, you would go ahead and start your tomatoes, your cucumbers, things like that inside. Of course, you would probably need a grow light and maybe a heat mat to get that going. So there's a good guide. And then on the 28th, they put direct seed cool season. So it says peas, mustard, kale, collards, pretty much all these cool season crops. You could go ahead and put in the ground at the end of this month, at the end of February. Most of the other things you're going to be doing right now is going to be preparing soil. If you haven't, my beds have kind of remained untouched for a few months. It's time to go out there and maybe look at the soil, maybe amend the soil before we direct sow some seedlings, and just get ready for next season. So great resource calendar. We'll get a link going for y'all for UT Ag Extension Planning Calendar. And then I also have this is the vegetable garden planning. There's a lot of information on this thing. But if you just need a nice cheat sheet of information for, this is really based for home residential gardening. They've got a lot of tips. Like if you're having troubles with your seedling, they have a whole one on how to figure out what's going on with your seedlings. They've got germination times and when to actually get your seedlings started for common crops around Middle Tennessee. And I appreciate how small their plant list is on here. They don't give you every single variety. They give you the main top crops we're going to grow. So great couple resources from Ag Department. And they usually update them every year. Last frost date for different counties. Ours is April 21st. So April 21st, that's usually what a lot of these seed packages are going to guide you by. So awesome resource for garden planning. There's a lot to think about, and simplifying it can really help. Couple extra notes for planning before we kind of do a real world example. Pathways. Don't forget your pathways. I would have at least 3 foot in between my beds just so you can walk. If you don't have that room there, you'll end up trampling crops. You can use straw. I tend to use like cedar mulch that doesn't decay as just a seasonal walking path that you may have to refresh every so often. Sun movement, so east to west. Knowing which direction the sun is going to come and then orienting your beds. If you can orient your beds, sun rises in the east, sets in the west. If you can set your beds going east to west, the length of them, you'll get a lot more sun exposure on those crops. May not be a huge world of difference, but it can really help with your production. So know which way the sun's going. Maybe that can be the way to orient your beds to get started. And then access to water. I mean, if these beds are a football field away from your house and you've got a 50-foot hose, it's going to be tough to get these watered. So just making sure you're within access of water or you can get water even if it's out of a creek or a well. That's pretty important. And then drainage. If this is sitting in a mucky, boggy area, I'm using raised beds. I'm not going in the ground. So look at those things you have going on in your landscape, and that may help you know where to put these beds. So process, we'll go ahead and start talking about my beds. I've got a couple of beds. I just took a quick picture. This was just a few days ago of my beds. There, you can see my leeks right there. Look at them. You know, they got a little frost damage, but they're doing just fine. They'll taste good. So I've got 2 beds. They're 4x8. My pathway in between is about 3 to 4 foot in between them. I've got my old tomato cages and everything laying in there. So my task this weekend is going to be cleaning up any weeds sitting in there, maybe tilling up the soil on one of my beds to get ready for direct sow for cold season. These are facing east, the way that we're looking. So these are east to west. The sun comes directly over these beds. Now there are trees on the edge of this property, so I've made sure to keep these beds a good distance away from those trees. They're about 50 foot away from the trees, so they don't get a ton of shade. So be mindful of that. You know, a lot of our crops can grow without all day sun. You're just not going to get as much production, and they may not be as strong. So these are my beds, and you know, we'll do a little jotting on the whiteboard here and just kind of go through a process. Like I said, the pathways, diversity, but I usually start with what I am actually going to eat. So I put cool season, warm season. Really, like I said, right now I'd worry about cool season. What I usually do with my beds is I'll do one cool season so I don't overload myself, and then I will start seeding the warm season as I'm harvesting the cool season. I don't usually do cool season in both of them, but you very well could. You just may have to rip crops out if you're trying to get the warm season stuff in. So I may do cool and warm. Get a nice bright orange. I'm going to put warm and cool. And this is the bed right here that has my cool season crops still going. So I'll probably mark where those crops are, and then I can direct sow around those crops. So currently, I've got leeks, and then I've got spinach. So that's what I've already got in the ground. All this extra room is stuff I can work with. You know, I've done crops both ways. I've done them this way. The benefit to running the crops east to west is you tend to get more sun exposure on them. So a lot of times I'll just do a crop here, and then I'll do a crop here. I've definitely got room back here. So I've really got room for 2 lines of crops. And then a lot of times with that bare space in the middle of the bed, you could put a 3rd row of crops. A lot of times I'll save that for my companion plants, things that I can put in between there that will benefit the cool season crops. But you could just as easily, you know, make sure your crops on the outside are shorter, and then you could put a 3rd line in the middle that's taller. I'll just mark how big these beds are. So 8 foot long, 4 foot wide, that's a pretty common dimension. The nice thing about your beds being 4 foot across is you can reach crops from both sides, and you don't have to worry about there being a dead zone in the middle of your bed. To me, a 6 foot wide raised garden bed is just not usable. You'll have dead space, so I usually stick within that 4 foot width. We'll get into maybe some more plants and make a list. You should also think about walking seating. You know, this is a pathway right here. You may put a bench, you know, something, or a stopping area so that you can enjoy your vegetable garden, and it makes it a place to engage. So maybe we have a couple benches down here below the bed. You know, I put maybe some containers. You could move some containers around those benches and have strawberries, herbs, stuff around those benches that you could smell, enjoy while you're taking a break from working on your veggie garden. So make room for seating, for walking, for enjoying your veggie garden. Cool season crops. I've got leeks. I've got spinach. What else do I want? So I'm not going to put spinach, leeks, and stuff like that. I've got some seed packets. Like I said, if you've already got seed packets, that's a good way to narrow it down. Chard. I think that would be a great one. I haven't done a lot of chard, but it is a really good, very nutritious vegetable, and it can take frost really well. Radishes. I've done radishes a few times. You know, they can be a little tough to get started, but once they go, I think direct sow is the way to go with these. Cilantro. Definitely one to get in early. So that may be one that's a really short crop that I put on the edges so that the other plants can get light. So cilantro, I think definitely. carrots. I mentioned I think we're going to do carrots in pots. So, for these carrots, I'm not going to put them in the ground this year. I'm going to put in containers, save some space in our beds. I've already got leeks. I love my leeks. I think they're so easy to grow, so pretty and evergreen in the winter. But I've already got them, so I'm not going to worry about leeks. Pretty easy to grow from seed. I've got some beets. I'll definitely do some beets. Really like beets. Big chunky seeds, so really easy to manage whenever starting these or direct sowing them. So I've got 4 cool season crops here. I've got some arugula and some kale. Maybe we'll do some kale too. Real similar to the chard in size and growth habit. So I've got 5 cool season vegetables to plant in this bed right now. So that's a good starting point. We can always add stuff later. If stuff isn't that successful, we can always start containerized materials that we buy from a nursery. There's no shame if the seedling process doesn't go great. That's why we're here to kind of help y'all out. If all your seedlings don't work out, we'll have starts for y'all as kind of a plan B. So I wouldn't worry about it if you have to fill in some voids. So I would just list out what I'm going to have. I'm just going to put rad for short. So there's 5 things, that kind of gives me a start. And I'm like, where am I going to put these? I mentioned the cilantro would be a good short crop, and I really don't need a ton of cilantro. It's not the bulk of what I will cook with, but it's really good fresh, and it's hard to find great stuff at grocery stores. So I think cilantro would be great for the short section over here. So I'm just going to put C. I believe cilantro, and a lot of times you can really look at these packets to tell you. I mean, this says 8-inch spacing on the rows, and if I've got about 3 foot there, I mean, I can easily put 4 cilantro plants in that space. And I'm just going to do dots for now. So there's my cilantro. If I want to do a middle row, which I think would be fine with the cool season, we'd want our taller stuff in the middle. And I think your kale and chard are generally going to get taller. So maybe that's a great middle crop. And again, just refer to, if you're not exactly on this, not a big deal. But, with this 24-inch spacing on the kale, it's a bigger plant, so it needs more room. So I'm really looking at maybe only 4 plants total in this space. So we should do 2 kale, and the chard gets about the same size. Yeah, 18-inch spacing. So we could do a couple kale and a couple chard. I don't use these as much either as I would say beets. So we'll put these in the middle. They'll get a little taller. And I'll just do 2 of each. So this will be chard. I think we can put them a little closer. Let's do 3 of each. Worst case scenario, you got to thin them out, and that's not the end of the world. To have too much of a harvest, take some inside, cook it, and then let the other ones grow. So I've got 6 right here. And then what I've got next is my beets and my radishes. And again, just take a look at your package. What does it say here? It says 12-inch spacing on these, so we could fit 8 radishes in that 8-foot section. The beets say the same, 12 inches. So we should be able to do 4 and 4 radishes and beets. And so there's just kind of my starting outline. This is really loose, really quick, but I'm just trying to get my head on how much I'm going to plant and where. If I'm starting these seeds indoors, I'm probably going to do double or triple the amount that I actually want to grow, because you're going to have some failures. You're going to have some successes. If you have 100% germination, that's great. You'll just have to find room for the extras. Otherwise, just double, triple, because you don't want to be producing less than you're actually going to be able to harvest and plant. So this is a really quick, cool season one. I don't know that I'm going to worry about warm season yet in February. That's something I'll probably plan out in March. Again, I've kind of been nicely scolded on planting too many tomatoes. So we're going to scale back the tomatoes and do some alternate stuff. I'll go ahead and say it's something I've had on my mind for a while, is doing an arch. So you can do architectural elements in your garden bed. And I've been thinking about growing some either cucumbers or squash on an arch to keep it up off the ground. And this can also make use of dead space. So maybe I'll put those between the garden beds. Which is kind of neat. It'll give the bed, something kind of neat, an arch, a different architectural feature, something you can walk under, something, I've got a 3-year-old, something he can play under and make a little fort. It's kind of cool to see these different vertical elements other than just stakes in the garden. So I think I'm going to do, once we get to warm season, I'll probably work on this here in about a month or two. I'll work on getting some fence paneling to make a nice arch to put those on. And I think that'll be a great element. Although notice I'm putting this towards the west side of the beds. So, this is our west side. That's where the sun's going to set. This allows that garden bed to get way more sun through the season before it hits that arch that's going to cast a shadow. So be very cognizant of bigger plants or structures casting a shadow on everything else. So there you could do easy sun. The sun goes that way over the beds. So we know that arch is not going to be shading out a whole lot of stuff. Maybe it would shade out the plants in the pots. So just think about those things whenever you're putting bigger things in the garden bed. Like I said, just a quick way to show how we can just get stuff on the board. Like I said, I think we're going to do some crops in the ground. I do still need to prepare that area. So that's something that you maybe could do through the month if you're going to have plants in the ground, direct into the earth. You may start working on that soil. You may get, if you're going to do black plastic or something to suppress the weeds, you may start getting that prepared because that way when the hot weather comes up, it doesn't sneak up on us. So you may start preparing earth, tilling, or clearing areas of weeds to start planting. I'm really erring on the side of potato. I love growing potatoes. They're easy, but gosh, they take up a lot of room. I think I'm going to do potatoes in the ground. Maybe corn. Corn really you need to plant multiple corn plants to get a decent crop. You need at least 2. I think that's one that I'll consider in the ground. I will say on the other end of the beds, I didn't tell you all about, I already have a crop on the other side, but that is actually for cut flowers. So we're talking about edibles. You can easily do, say, a cut flower garden. I've got dahlias on the other side in the ground. Anything that flowers is going to be a benefit to your garden. It's going to bring pollinators. It's going to bring bees in that we need to produce our crops. So having, say, a cut flower garden or a wildflower garden close to your veggie garden on one side is only going to be beneficial. So there's a lot of different elements we can put in to kind of make this veggie garden fully functioning. And those are things that we can just add year after year. You could easily just have an 8-foot strip of soil, and that's great to start producing, and then just grow that every year. I really like the raised garden beds. It makes it easy to plant it this way, and it makes it real simple for some of us to keep it clean and organized. So yeah, that's kind of my take on the garden planting. There are so many books out there and tutorials on different methods, and I think they're all great. They all have their merits. I usually do it real simple, trial and error. I will say something I didn't mention was rotating crops. So actually, now that I've thought about crop rotation, which is the idea that you shouldn't do the same crops in the same bed year after year, because those crops can carry pests or diseases with them, whereas if you remove them from that space for a year, those diseases can kind of settle down. This is the way I had my crops last year. So I had tomatoes over here and cool season stuff over here. What I'll probably do now, looking at that and thinking of the crop rotation, I'll probably just switch them, because I really don't want to do tomatoes 2 years in a row in the same bed. So thinking of that, I'll switch them. Not a big deal, but just something that's going to help the health of my garden. If I didn't switch them, it may be all okay, but I think it's just going to help with a lot of disease and insect pressure. So rotating your crops, real easy, and just something to have on the back of your mind when you're doing it. Extending growing season. This is going to be more of a fall thing, but there are cold frames, hoop houses, a greenhouse, a garage with grow lights in it. There are other structures that we can use to help extend our growing season, which are great. And these can also be elements in our garden. So there are other ways if you want to have tomatoes going into the cool season, or you want to kind of extend those warm season crops, we can have buildings or structures to kind of extend that. So consider structures, that may be a little more investment, but you can easily have stuff to extend the season. Although our winters are fairly mild in Tennessee compared to other places. So yeah, I'll just go back over. I mean, what are you going to do in February? Clean up your beds, make repairs, maybe start loosening the soil. I would probably amend the soil with compost just before you start sowing, so maybe a week before. Purchase seeds. If you haven't purchased your seeds, we've got a great selection here at Bates right now. There are tons of mail order catalogs. I could always recommend heirloom varieties, open pollinated varieties. I mean, they're just a really great way to enjoy something that has a history. Get your garden planned, start working this out so it doesn't creep up on you and you make knee-jerk decisions like I usually do and just grab what's in front of me. It'll give you a better idea so that you have a more successful and productive garden. And like I said, if you're going to eat it, grow it. If you're not going to eat it, then maybe that's not your first choice. I've definitely had the issue of overgrowing and not being able to eat everything I'm growing, and that's not the greatest feeling. You can always compost, but produce what you're going to use, I think, is a great way to think about it. And yeah, purchase seeds. Get those cool season plants started indoors if you haven't. Warm season starting indoors here in 2 or 3 weeks. So yeah, guys, it's coming up on us fast. Trying to think if there's anything I didn't touch on. I've got some dormant oil here. If y'all are looking for something to do right now, we just did this on all of our trees and shrubs. Dormant oil is a nice, organic, really safe and effective treatment for plants in the winter, especially fruit trees and shrubs. It's going to kill any overwintering insects just by smothering them out. Really easy to do. Do it when the weather's cold. If you have any trees and shrubs to maintain, dormant oil, great cost-effective way to control bugs. We just got a bunch of seed starting stuff in at the nursery, like literally last week. So we've got a bunch of different seed trays. So if y'all are starting your indoor seedling starting adventure, we've got tons of tools for y'all. We've got great soil products. Our indoor potting soil is perfect for seed starting. Coconut coir is also a good product for seed starting. So yeah, I mean, just dive in, y'all. It's really easy to get growing. And trial and error. If you haven't had a lot of luck with a crop, just move on and try something else, and you can always circle back around to it.
One question, Ben, about the pests that come through in warmer weather in Middle Tennessee. Mm-hmm. What are some good ways to cover or protect those cool season crops?
Yeah, I mean, cool season crops, especially when you're getting into things like cabbage, Brussels sprouts, stuff like that. I mean, cabbage worms are really kind of a big pest, and they can do a lot of damage. Keeping the area clean is one way you can really do that. So giving your plants space, if they're crammed and they're plant to plant, those cabbage worms are going to just hop from plant to plant and have a big feast. The rotation is going to be a big one. So if you've got, like I said, cabbage is a big one that really gets eaten up. If you have that in the same place year after year, you're going to have more pressure. So maybe consider moving those cool season crops around. I've had a lot of luck with them in containers, and insects seem to not really persist in containers as much. There's not as much real estate for them to inhabit, so they don't seem to pressure containers quite as much. There are some organic insecticide sprays you can use, but I tend to not really use a lot of that stuff. Herbs, I think, are a great way to get some of that. A lot of our herbs have insect repelling qualities to them, especially just about any herb that has a fragrance or a smell, like our mints, any of your Italian herbs, your marjoram, your sage, your thyme. Those are going to be a great thing to plant. It may not be timely for those in the cool season, but I think we'll get some herbs in March, and you can easily put those in the ground with your cabbage or your kale and stuff like that. So my biggest thing is to just check on them. The most organic way to take care of the pest is physical removal. So just going out there and checking on your plants every day or two, and if you're seeing that insect pressure, either spray them off with a hose or shake them off or pick them off if they're really that many. So yeah, we do get a lot of pests. I tend not to spray for them because we also have beneficial insects, and if you're spraying for the bad ones, you may affect the good ones. So, just letting nature do its thing without getting in the way too much, and then doing our physical best. Birds, even though birds can sometimes eat some of our crops, having birds around can also help control some of our pests and insects. So, having a bird feeder on the property to let the birds at least be there, but maybe not right next to your veggie garden, we can kind of use nature to help tone down those insect problems.
Cool. And just adding, I've made some conduit with some insect mesh netting that has greatly reduced the amount. I wouldn't say it would completely eliminate it, because they can find a way to get in there.
Sure. And moths and stuff. I mean, a lot of our little wormies that eat them come from moths, just getting in there. And a lot of people use the covers, and that's something I consider doing, is you can either use like a frost blanket, or they make a more warm season, just mesh cover.
Fine mesh.
Yeah, a fine mesh cover. And it's usually really, really tight. You almost can't see the holes in it. But it's literally stopping moths and flying insects from getting into those crops. Really good for cool season crops, and it also will probably help with a little bit of frost damage. A lot of people use just PVC pipes, and they'll just curl them in a hoop over their bed and then just throw that cloth over it and then seal it at the ends. I think we even sell pre-made hoop tunnels that you just pull out like an accordion, put on your beds. It's basically a bug net for your vegetable garden. So yeah, if you want a physical method for doing it, those hoop houses, a little bit of a investment, but you should be able to use them for at least a few years. Yeah. That would be the foolproof way. I think the tough part is harvesting. So, with those, you'll probably use them through the grow season, but when you're going to harvest, you'll probably take that fabric off. So just something to think about. It was nice to be back this winter, and we're all looking forward to spring here. So yeah, if y'all have any more questions, shoot it to here at Bates Nursery. There's a lot of different methods you can use to get a hold of us. So let us know if you have any questions. We'd be more than glad to help. March 1st, or at least first week of March, we're looking at getting our veggie starts. So those of y'all who are hankering to stick something in the ground, we've got them coming. And if y'all are looking for seed, now's the time to get going. We've got those ready for you. So, if you've got the itch like I do, it's time to gear up and kick off those cold weather blues and get ready to eat. So thank you.